as we welcome in the business of sport once again, our big guest today, Ritch Winter, longtime NHL agent, and we talk all different businesses, sides of sports. Ritch, welcome back to the show, man. How you doing?
It was an adventure getting here, I have to tell you, but otherwise good.
Well, you still got summer tires on or what?
No, but I had to, I didn't bring my scraper, and there must have been a quarter of an inch on. Thank goodness the guy was in the parking lot, would lend me his. So
I know it. There's a lot of sleet, if we want to call it there, the frozen rain today. So
it was an interesting adventure.
Yeah, you want to have a scraper. So hey, anybody listening, you know what to buy Ritch for Christmas. He needs a scraper for his vehicle.
I have one at home. I'll have to find it.
Very simple things. Now, we just had Eric Zabrowski, and great success story of a guy who persevered. And I love this. That he goes, you know what, geez, maybe I shouldn't have been here at times. And that's a good way to look at it. But he did have some interesting news how, he had gone through double Tommy John surgeries back to back, right? And it was just like, you know what, man, I think I'm going to call his agent. I'm going to retire. He says, his agent told him, I will fly out there and I will kick your ass if you quit. Right. So at times, you being the agent, have you ever had to, I'm sure there's times where you got to talk your player down off the ledge, but are there other times where you've had to give him a swift kick in the, to say, no, there's no feeling sorry for yourself here. Let's go.
I haven't really had that experience other than, with our next guest in a sense, because I think it's taken us all a long time to understand. And I would be pushing in situations like, I think I grew up, small town Alberta, Drumheller. I'm from the suck it up, sort of family, right? Okay. So tendency is to say in those situations, no, you got to persevere. Come on, hang in. And I learned through my relationship with Slater that, and I think to some degree with my kids and with other people I've got to know over time and other athletes who have struggled, that there's more going on there sometimes. And maybe the right approach isn't to push, right? It's fine if it's an ACL tear and he needs some surgery because we can understand that. But if it's anxiety, if it's some form of other, social anxiety, maybe he's got an alcohol problem we didn't know about, maybe he's got ADHD, and we're all learning about that. And I think what we're learning more than anything, and it took me a long time, because I think I thought of athletes like everybody else, big, strong, powerful. You don't think of them getting scared.
Right.
You don't think of them having anxiety. You don't think of them having the same problems we do, but they do, right? They worry about their children. They've got all kinds of issues. And so I think that more than anything, that was probably where I pushed. I pushed a guy when, if I had a better understanding of mental health, I might have hugged him.
And we're going to have Slater Koekkoek on, who, of course, played for the Oilers. Slater ended up retiring from the game, and we'll let him explain the exact reasons for that. He's really never spoke about it in Edmonton. So very much looking forward to that interview with Slater coming up. He'll join us in about right after the first break. And, and we can talk about, Ritch, kind of the evolution, being an agent. And, that was probably something you really learned a lot about, that, when we look at the agent book, there's not a lot of, not a lot of agents have a psychology background. And you've talked about that. Maybe that as much as having a lawyer background is good, just maybe having a psychology background might be just as valuable.
Well, it's interesting because I think it would surprise people the kinds of exchanges you get into. I remember, I tell people, one of the greatest moments I felt I had as an agent, when I got a call, I look at the phone, it's from the Czech Republic. I don't know the name, who it is. So I bet I pick it up, and I won't say who it was, but she says, Ritch, it's so-and-so. I need help with my dad. And I thought to myself, well, I'm part of the reason for that is she knows I have 4 girls, so maybe I might have learned something. Her
father was one of your clients.
One of our clients, okay. Yeah. And now he wasn't real thrilled when I intervened because I thought she had a really good point. But in the end, he did 60% of what I suggested, having 4 girls. I mean, you have 4 girls, you've got a fair amount of grounding in girl, right? And and so by the time you get to the 4th one, you're a little bit more patient, a little more understanding. So it did work out, but I thought the relationship between me, my wife, my kids, and their family was such that 16-year-old girl felt comfortable calling me and asking for advice. That was very cool. And so that kind of thing is what people don't really see. Wives call for advice. Wives are concerned. They think hubby has a drug problem. They're not sure what's going on. And I'm a behavioral science junkie. I do a lot of reading, so that's helpful. But, guys like Michael Gervais, who's a good friend of mine, one of the top high-performance psychologists in the world. I mean, we need more of those people that are very good at what they do in the game, because players are more broken between here most often than they are anywhere else. And that's hard to see because, they come from places where they're the big man on campus. They're the best player in town. They're the best player in the area, the best player on their, Canadian Hockey League team. and they're scared to death about what's ahead of them. Sometimes it was hard for me to understand because, like I said, I came from a rural Western Canadian background where you fall off the horse, man. You just get right up. But my leg's broken, Dad. So what? We'll fix it.
Yeah. No, that's fair. This past week with all that's gone on with the Rangers, the coach puts out the memo to the other 31 GMs, and everybody knows it's going to be public within a week or within a day probably. And so the role of the agent, when your player, all of a sudden his name's out there, does the agent call the GM right away to say, okay, like, do you guys want to trade him? Is this legit? Is it not? Take us through what the agent would do when one of your if Trouba's your player or Kreider's your player. I'm assuming you talk to them first, but then does the agent, is it your job to call the GM? Does the player call the GM? How does that work?
I think it depends on the player because you have players who are, very shy, not, sometimes very tough, very big, very strong. I'm thinking one particular player I won't mention, but just gentle and quiet and shy. He wouldn't call.
Okay.
Esa Tikkanen would go in and start throwing things around in the general manager's office.
Okay.
So I think it depends on the situation. It depends on the player. But that might be interesting as a future guest because Kurt Overhart, who's Trouba's agent, is a very close friend of mine. And maybe that kind of exchange at some point is kind of be interesting to have two agents go at it as to what they might have done. But I have no idea. But Jacobs, I met him once. He's a pretty stable, pretty strong guy. Got a good family background. In that case, there's a good chance he might have just handled it on his own.
So, and if he goes in there and is like, because if you have the no movement clause, now his is limited now, right? So you have your team, you submit your team, and I want to explain that to the player. So every year you're able to, if you have a limited no move clause that says you have a team of 15, every June or May, depending on the date, you can submit a new one. Right? Yeah. Take us through, like, how strategic is it? Where is it like, okay, some teams are automatic because they just never want to be there.
Right.
But then, like, I'm assuming if you're the New York Rangers, you're like, well, I don't need to put New Jersey on my list because they're probably never changing me to New Jersey. You know what I mean? Like, do you look from year to year where who's their three biggest rivals? Probably not, because we don't see those teams ever trade there. Like, if I'm a Calgary Flame, I don't need to put Edmonton in my no move list because Calgary's never trading to Edmonton if you're a good player. It's just not happening.
Well, and I think it has a lot of dynamics because first you eliminate, like you say, you eliminate the ones that wife would kill me, right?
Yeah.
That's usually a big factor. And then, well, maybe, I have really good chemistry with so-and-so. That would be an interesting spot. Don't love the city. And then usually you'll get it down. Let's say you got 8 or 10. Now you might get it down to 14. Now you got to start filtering through that, right? Taxes. Right? Geez, I'm making $4 million and there's no taxes in Texas, you think. And then you look at teams, there's no way they're going to pick me up. No. I don't like them, but I don't have to put them on the list because they're so deep in whatever position, defense or goal. I don't have a chance. So there's just a lot of dynamics. Sometimes families get involved. I remember when Marian Hossa went to Chicago, we ended up getting Tomas Kopecky as part of the deal for a lot of strange reasons, but if you watch Slovak players, you've probably seen them in the dressing room. You get Czech and Slovaks talking together for some reason. When they communicate in their own language, they have more fun than a human being has the right to have. And so having those, maybe that's a factor. Kopi's there. You know what? Our wives are friends. We grew up in Trenchine together. So there's just so many factors. The only consistent one is, never there. And there's lots of those spots as they look like Ottawa. Used to be Edmonton, less so now with Connor here. Calgary's on that list.
Winnipeg still
interesting. Winnipeg is not always on the list because some people like Mason Appleton demanded a trade from Seattle after he got picked back to Winnipeg. I think the players that have been there and have friends from there, it's you have to think of Edmonton. Edmonton drive from the airport down to to the White Mud. It's not that exciting. It's kind of not that great driving downtown. But you get out in the suburbs here, living on the river in that area, it's beautiful. But same with Winnipeg. There's an awful lot of beautiful areas. Not much traffic, small town.
Right.
So it's not automatically on the list.
Yeah, great fan base. Like if you're playing a Canadian market and you like to be in a place where they want to eat, breathe, live hockey, that's a big advantage.
Well, sometimes you have to hold their nose because, geez, they're winning. And I think that, winning is so much more satisfying than the alternative. That has a lot of effect. Now, where it has the most effect is the woman and her 3 children who have to stay at home in -40 when he's off on a road trip to Florida. So that often has a big play, where and guys don't always think about that because Athletes are very selfish and very self-focused, and they have to be good. That's how they commit the time. That's how they put everything they need to do first and foremost. But when they start thinking about their families, then those kind of things kind of come into play. And you can imagine a woman that they met in Florida who's lived her entire life in the southern United States going to be a little challenged to think of a possibility of minus 40.
True. Although it's only for a week.
Yeah.
Now, when we return, Slater Koekkoek is going to join us, and we'll talk about his journey, talk about the, just mental health and how, for an NHL player to step away, really kind of the first of its kind, something we hadn't seen a lot of in the National Hockey League. That in itself might have been a burden. We'll talk with Slater next on the Jason Gregor Show on Sports 1440, Oilers Nation, YouTube, and Facebook. We're up to 1250 now on the golf, so we're up and rolling. We always start a little slow, and then we ratchet things up. I love it. 833-401-1440, 1250 on package one, the golf. 1650 on the Mr. Dirk package, which is still well below face value. So we'll get them both up on the month of giving on Jason Gregor Show on Sports 1440, Oilers Nation, YouTube, Facebook, and X. Jason Gregor, Connor Hanley with you. Ritch Winter joins us once again in the business of sport here on Sports 1440, Oilers Nation, YouTube, and Facebook. And we get to our big guest of the day, brought to you by Silent Rides Charter Company, one of Alberta's premier bus charter companies with state-of-the-art motor coaches that will safely take you or your group to your next destination. Book your ride today at silentrides.ca. Ride safe and in style. And our next guest, of course, ended up being one of Ritch Winter's clients. Didn't start out as a client, was the 10th overall selection in the 2012 NHL entry draft. Of course, also a former member of the Edmonton Oilers. Slater Koekkoek joins us on the program. Slater, welcome to the show, man. How you doing?
I'm doing well. I was surprised to hear that Ritch had another fellow on the show. I didn't know anybody else could get a word in with him.
Now, Slater, you had a very interesting, and we were talking about Ritch, like an interesting journey out, high draft pick. And with a high draft pick, I think there's a lot of stress, there's a lot of excitement, there's a lot of things that go into it. And you've been pretty open about how, you had to step away from the game just really for your mental health more than anything else. And, Ritch talked about it earlier in our first segment, how, at the time he didn't really know enough about how to support and work with it. Cause a lot of the adages will just work harder, right? Just kind of push through it. I'm assuming you must've met a lot of that along the way, which probably works even counterproductive when you've got mental health, challenges at that point. So kind of take us through how difficult it was in the world of hockey when it really wasn't talked about a lot, that the mental health struggles and challenges that a lot of players have, and that sometimes you just need to talk about it, but it was never really has been there. And I'm not even sure it still is, overly received well in the NHL.
Yeah, I think that there have been some strides, but I'll go back to earlier in your line of questioning there. Ritch wasn't always my agent. I felt in my career that I wasn't being fought for in a way that I wanted to be. And Ritch had a client who was on my team, a good friend in Adam Ernie. And he said, you really need to talk to this guy. He really backs me up. He really has my back in situations where players maybe are getting the short end of the stick in their organization or aren't getting the looks that they deserve. So that's what led me to Ritch. We got along well. I know I like to joke with him a little bit about getting a word in because he's got the gift of the gab, but just overall a guy who would fight for his clients, and that's what brought me to Ritch. In the sense of the mental health aspect, I think that through our relationship and how it's grown, Ritch has realized that I was not going to be somebody who was persuaded into doing something that I wasn't wanting to do or wasn't in a position to do. And that was tough for him. It was tough as an agent. They have a line of duty to fight for their clients, and it's also a business. And I know that Ritch is, he gets a fee from his players, and that means a lot to his line of work as well. So in the aspect of an agent-player relationship, I think we went through a lot of learning on what that looks like. And, for me, standing up for myself and what I was going through, I think that was quite the journey we went on. I think that in my journey, I started in Tampa, really struggled to get my foot in the door there. They had good teams. You know, we went to the Cup final in 2015 when I was just trying to break my way into the league. Solid veterans. You had good D back there. It just wasn't the situation for me. I got moved to Chicago, which was a great opportunity. We did well. We went, you know, into the playoffs my second year, which was during the shortened season. So, you know, that was a great opportunity. Then I got moved to Edmonton where, you know, for multiple reasons, it just wasn't quite the right fit. The on-ice aspect didn't go as planned. And yeah, there's my career in a nutshell.
So, you know, you go through that and you said what you had to do what was right for you at that moment. And that's hard for a lot of people, especially, you know, because on the outside, everybody's like, well, I'd love to be an NHL player. Who wouldn't want to be an NHL player? That's like the greatest thing ever, right? Like that's what we want to be. And in one sense, I understand that reasoning. And I'm sure you can relate to that. Like, hey, who wouldn't want to be an NHL player? You're an NHL player who's even on the worst day, it's probably still pretty fun. But if it's not fulfilling or you're too stressed out or you've got other problems, eventually you can't mask it. So how did you get to that point, Slater? Because I'm guessing there were times where you tried to hide it and not talk about it and kind of push that down, which is I think what a lot of people do when they're battling with mental health.
Yeah, I did it my whole career. It was something I was struggling with, mostly in my eating. My anxiety would show up in the lack of, in my appetite shutting down and in the struggles of not being able to eat before games, night before games. You know, I would hide that in the sense of not going out to dinner with teammates, just in case that I couldn't eat anything. I didn't want that embarrassment of having to tell my teammates that, you know, I just get this nervous stomach before games, and you know that's why I'm so thin, and that's why I, you know, don't have the sufficient energy or any of those things. I didn't want to get into that sort of conversation. What really pushed me in that moment, and I think back at this as just a beautiful moment in my life. Ritch was in the room actually, and Ken Holland called us in for a meeting, and Ritch was there, and we wanted more ice time. I wanted more ice time, and I was a healthy scratch a lot. And Ken Holland looked at me and he said, do you know what you are, Slater? And I said, no, tell me. And he said, you're a clock killer. He said, you don't do anything positive on the ice, but you don't do anything negative either. And I honestly, Jason, I looked after that meeting, I really evaluated my life in the sense of, you're going to put on me that I don't do anything positive and don't do anything negative with the struggles that I'm going through every day on a day-to-day basis. Okay, I'll reevaluate what I'm doing with my time, and I'll show you the positive impact I can make on the world. That ended up not being hockey. It wasn't something that I wanted to continue my fight on a day-to-day basis on the sense of the hockey side. It ended up being pursuing other life goals and pursuing things that I want in my life on the business side or on the personal side. And that's what that turned me to. But that was ultimately a huge moment for me.
So when you look at that conversation, was it a negative or a positive?
It was a positive in my life. It brought me to where I am now in this situation where, you know, and Ritch can attest to it, that I'm living for me. I'm living for what I want in this life and what I believe are my dreams and my goals. It's not for something, you know, it was funny that you mentioned, you know, young boys in Canada have this aspect of NHL was the dream. My life will be complete if I get to the NHL. And that was always my small town Ontario. I grew up in a town of, you know, in the bigger town, there was 3,000, but our town was, you know, 75 to 100 people. Like it was very small, rural Ontario. That to get to the NHL, that was like a 0.00% chance. So to do that, that was huge. My grandfather played, you know, high level hockey in the town, and you know, ended up becoming a school teacher. But to get to the NHL, like that was an amazing thing, and that's been a big part of my therapy sessions is um, that it didn't fill me. It wasn't something that completed my life. It wasn't this aha moment of my life is filled, and why is that, or what am I destined for? That has been a big struggle of feeling guilt towards walking away when everybody would die towards it. It was and still is to this day a struggle that I go through with my therapist.
Now I'm going to ask you, and then Rich can give his side of things on this, because that conversation with Ken Holland happened in Edmonton in the last stop of your career. But when you went to Chicago, you talked about being a better opportunity. But you and Rich together, you had to help get refocused, get back into the lineup. Can you talk about some of the work that you guys did together to help you get back into the lineup at that point and keep your career going for a few more years?
You want me to go with this, Rich?
Sure. Yeah. Your perspectives, I think, way more interesting.
Well, I think that Chicago, excuse me, presented an interesting opportunity. It was a young team. It was, a team that had come off super successful seasons, kind of a rebuild, young coach in Jeremy Colleton. And it was an opportunity that presented itself that I like to think I did well with that opportunity. It was, nobody was kind of set in their spots. We had a great leader in Jonathan Toews, who I was just talking to Ritch about. Like, he was the best captain that I could have ever asked for. He was everything towards the young players, towards the guys on the boat. He didn't make us feel any less than any other guy in that room. And I think that that's ultimately, like, anybody you talk to about Jonathan Toews, they will share that just the human being that he is, and how he makes those around him feel valued. And that's what I really respected. And I really thrived in that situation of somebody listening and somebody, asking how I felt. He would invite everybody to dinner that wasn't exactly in the higher echelon of him or Duncan Keith or Patrick Kane. He didn't care. We were all human beings, and we were all somebody with feelings that needed to be nurtured. Call it soft, or call it, somebody being vulnerable in the sense of this man's world. But he was just this ultimate leader that wanted the best out of everybody and would do anything it took to get that. And that's why I think that I had a lot of good years there.
I think, Slater, it was interesting. In retrospect, I remember when you were struggling, you weren't in the lineup, and I was worried about you because you didn't seem to be enjoying life that much. And I think we, just to a degree, stumbled on ways through our goal setting. We do goal setting, as Slater knows, with all of our players to get very clear on what they want. We work with the coaching staff to ensure that there's good communication there. But what happened was, I remember, I was just worried about Slater. Didn't ever really understood why he was staying home so much, or when I would go on the road and hook up with other teammates and he wasn't coming for dinner. And I understand it now, but I think what was, remember, Slater, I was so worried about you being alone. We came up with ideas like you taking the young guys who were stuck in the hotel out to do things. And I think to a degree, by accident, maybe I hit on some things that allowed you to maybe focus on something different for a while, because I think you probably played your best consistent hockey in Chicago through the playoffs there. And I think maybe, at least for a moment, we didn't solve the problem, but at least for a moment, maybe we're starting to understand how to help you deal with it. And I think what you make the point about Jonathan Toews is, I think what we all have to do is learn to be more emotionally intelligent, to learn to read the emotions of others in the room, so we can identify people like you that are struggling and maybe scared to get the help that they need. So
yeah,
I know your
I would
thoughts
agree
on that experience. When you went to the boat show and you did all those things.
Yeah, I think that I found, I don't want to share his personal journey, but Brendan Perlini was a great friend of mine in Chicago and in Edmonton, who we leaned on each other, and we really had that relationship that people might have called us weirdos. We would sit together on the plane, and we had this bond of two teammates who would struggle with being in and out of the lineup, and who would struggle in our own sense of what personally we were dealing with. But I think having that person, that ally you can share things with, who you aren't scared of being judged in those moments, is super important, and something that whether it be through the NHLPA or training along those lines of maybe there's a teammate that is certified in some sort of counseling that everybody knows that they can go to without fear of being told by the coach or told on by the coach, something like that, where everybody's trying for the same goal, but we get selfish. Like I heard you talking earlier, Rich, about how athletes are selfish, and everybody's so determined on their personal goal that they forget about what ultimately gets you to that goal is the seventh D sometimes. And I know you have stories out the wazoo here, Rich, about the seventh D coming into the Stanley Cup final who ends up blocking the shot or shooting and getting a rebound or something like that. But it really is interesting who becomes a factor. So don't discount the guy making league minimum, and don't just shove him to the side because he's not in the lineup every night. He actually matters, and he actually is a human being that can have an impact on your team. But ultimately, why wouldn't you want to help that human being? I don't understand that.
Well, I think, I would say I'm really excited about the new executive director of the NHLPA. I haven't been excited about many of them, but Marty not only has a lot of accomplishments as mayor of Boston and secretary of labor, but he's an alcoholic. And I think that gives him the perspective that he needs in this environment. And these players that are playing in these high pressure environments, Slater is held accountable every shift. If he's not playing well, you might be talking about it on the radio. Fans are certainly talking about it. It's an awful lot of pressure. And I think Marty brings a intuitive sense to his position of the importance of the things Slater is talking about. And I think what we're going to see over time, he's invited agents to get involved in certain of their programs to learn what's being done. And I think he's starting to realize the support. We have to build that support system around the players no differently than we do around our own kids, because Slater will probably tell you, when you're an athlete, you have a very small circle of friends because you don't know who you can trust. You don't really you don't always feel like being identified as the defenseman with the Chicago Blackhawks. You want to be, you want to just be a guy,
Right.
And I think that puts them in a position they don't have many people to talk to. So to hear Slater talk about Jonathan Toews, that's important. We need to educate our players so they can help their teammates. And I think the thing that, if you look at the coaches that have been very successful in various sports, Phil Jackson, Pete Carroll, Steve Kerr, the one foundational element, I don't think X and O's are important. They're modestly important, and you need to figure out where you're playing and where you're going. But what's more important is how you treat your players. And if you talk to Pete and you talk to Phil Jackson, you talk to Lou Lamoriello, they'll define the relationships that they have with their players, the foundational element that led to many of the greatest teams they've had, and what leads to consistent success for coaches like Phil Jackson is the fact that their players felt like they loved them, right? That they would be there for them. They would want to go for the wall for them because they knew through all the little things that Pete did, Phil did, that are unbelievable, really, how connected they were with the psychology of their players. We need more of that. Not much of it in hockey, right? These coaches come out of college, they're better educated, they've had more experiences, they might even had psychology 101, right? And so I think we need more of that so that Slater doesn't have to struggle. We need the agents to understand better, and I think that, we fail these guys because we let them play, we let them do what they do. And at the end of the day, at 30, 31, 32, we throw them out into the real world with no guidance, no direction. And they may have been suffering like Slater has for years. And it doesn't get easier when your money starts running out and your wife wonders why you have to move back to Canada because you can't afford medical insurance in the US and the kids are disconnected and alcohol becomes involved. We just cheat these guys. These guys are held accountable every single shift, every single moment they're at work. We are not. And I think we need to be more accountable, because Slater does what he does, and I make a great living because people like him do it. Gary Bettman makes a slightly better living, but those Gary Bettman, Rich Winter, Marty Walsh, agents in this business, we need to give back and help them, and they have more needs than we realize. And it's unfair that we don't recognize it because they're gladiators, and we actually think the gladiator is who he looks like in the motion picture poster, and he's not.
Slater, with your experience, have you talked to Marty Walsh? Have you talked to even individual teams in the sense that it's probably an area that they're really lacking all and not, ignorance is bliss sometimes. I don't know if it's vengeful ignorance by any stretch, but I think it's ignorance nonetheless. Have those conversations gone on? Is that something you'd be interested in?
I had initially reached out to the new doctor of the PA, Dr. Gold, who is doing fabulous things for the NHLPA. He was my contact later in my journey with the player assistance program, and continues to check in on a somewhat regular basis, on just potentially being that contact. If somebody with a team is struggling, who knows, maybe a flight to go for dinner. If dinner's triggering for them, maybe it's just a coffee like it was for me. It doesn't have to be this formal thing, but just somewhat of an ally that can be somebody to touch base with on somebody who's been through this. And my journey ended up being that I didn't go back to the game, but you see guys go back to the game after. They might still love it. They might still want to be in that. And I wouldn't be discouraging them from going back to the game or anything along those lines. It would be more that you have an ally and somebody that's been through those struggles that can either point you in the right direction or just help you through a tough time.
We'll take a quick break. We'll come on. We want to continue this on. I do want to get your thoughts, about anxiety overall, because we got a lot of texts coming in from people. So I want to ask you about that and more when we return. Jason Gregor, Ritch Winter, Slater Koekkoek with you on Sports 1440, the business of sports here on Sports 1440, sports1440.ca, and Oilers Nation, YouTube, Facebook, and X. Today in the business of sport, we have former NHL'er Slater Koekkoek, of course, who was the 10th overall selection in the 2012 NHL entry draft, played for the Lightning, the Blackhawks, and the Edmonton Oilers, and ultimately stepped away from hockey for his own mental well-being. He mentioned his anxiety just became too much of a factor for him. And Slater, anxiety is, for people who don't have anxiety, I think we truly, and I don't know if we truly understand it. You talk about like yours would get so bad that you couldn't even eat. And, which people are like, hey, you got to fuel up the machine if you want to play in the NHL all the time, right? So it made it more challenging. What was the final point for you where the anxiety, where you said, it's just too much for me and I've got to step away? Was there like one breaking point, or was it just a combination of steps along the way?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you now. Yeah.
It wasn't any specific aspect that really drove me to that edge. I mentioned the meeting with Ken Hall, and I mentioned, trying to get my foot in the door, just not being able to really pry that open. Dealing with specific coaches that I was. I thought it's the time. It had become that my anxiety and what I was dealing with and how I was dealing with it didn't become worth it for what I was doing. It was too much of a struggle that, I was, overthinking and worried about things that I shouldn't have been, for something I felt that I wasn't being valued in. So I'm going to put my life first and my time and my priorities first, which ultimately led me to get the help for things outside of hockey. Like, there's going to be anxieties in everybody's life, no matter if you're an NHL player or not. Like Rich mentioned, financial situations of having a family, of keeping a job or career, whatever that might be. Those all stem anxiety for everybody in the world. And you know what? obviously lots of people deal with it and deal with it in different ways, and have different symptoms. For me, it was eating. When I was younger, I would throw up. When I got to the NHL, maybe OHL and NHL, it was, I would just struggle to eat much, if anything, on the day of games or before games. Um, so it shows up in different ways. And then after hockey, you have other things that show up, and you deal with those things. That it's just that it is worth it in your life to deal with those things that I really hit home with, and that drove me to where I went.
Well, I've always talked about it, Slater. When I explain it to people, I said, anxiety is a wonderful thing if you confront a grizzly bear on a walk in the mountains, right? But if it lasts for 3 days, just try and feel that lasting for 3 days. That's really hard. And I think the other thing that is so difficult for these athletes, how do you go to your coach and say, I'm under the weather, I don't feel mentally ready to play? Like, it's so much pressure not to get help from the people that are around you, that we've just created an environment where we are destroying some kids, and we don't know all the stories about older players do. They've all see their friends fall. And sometimes players, Slater lasted for 6, 8 years. Other players last through their whole careers and they don't fall completely apart till it's over. We just need to really focus on making sure that we support it. It's hard to believe NHL players don't have medical coverage when they retire. Now, they can buy it for $20,000, $30,000 a year. And if you're making $5, $6 million a year for 10 years, you can afford it. If you're up and down in the minors, you save, $1 million. Everybody think, well, that's amazing. You're 31, but your medical costs of coverage, you don't have enough money to pay for that for the rest of your life. You can imagine, play that out for a PHPA member in the AHL who's made $127,000 for 8 years. He can't afford medical coverage. He can't get help. He has no, and these are things, I think, part of the reason, Slater, why you come on shows like this is to maybe help people understand how important this is.
Yeah, I would agree. I think that if I can help one person, and we've seen, I shared with Ritch a story about my initial call to the NHLPA, in the sense of looking for assistance, and the call went, my name is Slater Koekkoek. I'd like to join the player assistance program, and the first question I was asked was, what's the substance you're dealing with? And I said to the person in charge, I said, well, I'm actually not dealing with a substance, but do you want me to? Because it was driving to that, who knows where it would have led, but just because it was only anxiety, I think that's an issue. And I think that it has gotten better. We've seen some players join the program. We don't want to speculate on what it's for, but it could be for mental health reasons, and for that, I applaud them on taking that leap as I did. But I think that initial factor of it just being a mental health thing has to stop.
Slater, if you could give advice to an agent, to a parent, to a coach, how is the best way to help an athlete who's dealing with high anxiety?
Fascinating question. I think that everybody is so different. And I mentioned to Ritch, Ritch felt a little bit of guilt towards not knowing how to deal with me in those situations. And I said to him, Ritch, I actually thank you for, in his words, he was being a little bit pushy, or a little bit maybe selfish in the way that he was wanting me to return to the game. And I said, thank you, in the sense of, I needed that push back towards the game. So I knew that I was testing those waters, that this is something that I really wanted to do, that I wanted to take my life outside of the game. But I had all kinds of different people. My wife is an amazing support system. She's more on the feeling side of things, on the emotion of, are you happy in what you're doing? Are you content in the life that you're living? there are other things out there. She's been amazing on making sure that I know my value as a human being, and I know my value as a business leader or a mental health advocate, all of these things. But I needed Ritch, and I would say my family, my mother and father, hardest working people I know, and kept the same career for 30 plus years. My mom is a nurse, and my dad works for Hydro One, steady, always there, never took a sick day. They just put their nose down and grind. And, they were there telling me, like, are you sure this is what you want to do? It took you so many years to get there. And I needed those different aspects in my life. That ultimately everybody needs a different recipe. And I was just so thankful and so lucky that I had the one that I did.
Well, I think the one thing that's really hard, and it's hard for people that haven't played professional sports to understand, Slater, it's when you're identified and recognized as an athlete, when many times you just want to be Slater, right? And it's really hard because you just don't get seen as a human being much. And that's a really insular world that they live in. I can't imagine what it's like to be Michael Jordan, where you just can't be Michael, right? You get a chance over at Chelly's house, maybe periodically, but it must be horrible. And I'm sure to some degree, it's hard, Slater. You feel like if I'm not a hockey player, I'm not really anything anymore. You dreamed about it since you're 4. You mentioned every kid in your town probably envied you and hoped to be you. And you just want to just be with Santana, put on a fire and forget about hockey for a while and have friends that see you as valuable for what you're doing off the ice, doing what you're doing today or to getting involved in your business, just being there as a good husband and friend. And sometimes you just want to be a good husband and friend, and nobody seems to care about that, right?
Yeah, it's interesting. It was when I first left the game, there was a lot of embarrassment, shame, looking back at statistics, 10th overall pick of, only playing 160 some games and, only having X amount of points. And my therapist, Claude, she's an athlete herself, and what an amazing human being. We probably work on it. We still have sessions at once every 2 weeks. And it's something I bring up all the time on, should I be embarrassed of that? And, I never did much with my hockey career. And I finally gotten to a place where it's still an amazing accomplishment to be proud of. And I lead a lot of my business conversations in networking events with that I am and was an NHL player, that I got there, and it opens up a ton of doors. So I think being proud of that aspect is something that I've had to learn to do. And to be Slater outside of hockey is a journey that, there's 300 and some players in the NHL. Every single one of them is going to have to go through that journey at some point in their life. I just chose to do it a little bit earlier.
Slater, I really appreciate this. Love to have you back on another time, because I got lots more to discuss, but we're up against it. So thanks so much for this, and happy that you have found happiness in where you're at. That's the most important thing, and really appreciate you sharing your story today. Thanks so much.
Take care,
okay, guys. Have a great night.
That is Slater Koekkoek, who, of course, left the NHL. Anxiety just became too much for him. And, when he said, hey, I needed to go, and it's the best thing that happened to me, because you know what? There's Slater Koekkoek, the person, and Slater Koekkoek, the hockey player, and they're very different. And Ritch, he said, hey, man, I had to learn a lot as an agent. And I think, we can get into that next week on the Business of Sport. I think this is going to be fascinating. We're going to talk about all the new technology that's available in sport and what's being used, what isn't being used, and the benefits of it. And so I very much look forward to that next Wednesday. Have yourself a great week.
Yep. Talk to you next week.